It started as just another day at the bustling downtown cafe. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, painting golden streaks on polished wooden tables. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of baked goods, while the low hum of conversation filled the air. People sat in clusters, typing on laptops or chatting over steaming mugs, each absorbed in their morning rituals. At her usual spot by the window sat Karen, a middle-aged woman who had become something of a regular fixture at the cafe. Her sharp features and ever-watchful eyes gave her an air of authority she hadn't earned but often tried to wield. Known by the staff and more than a few patrons for her unsolicited opinions and unkind remarks, Karen prided herself on being what she called observant. Others might have used a less flattering term, nosy. Today, Karen's gaze was fixed, unblinking, on one particular figure in the room. Across the cafe, seated at a small table near the counter, was a man who couldn't have blended in even if he'd wanted to. He wore a crisp black jacket, the kind that spoke of understated style, paired with aviator sunglasses that reflected the room like mirrors. But what really caught Karen's attention was the red MAGA hat perched confidently on his head, tilted slightly to one side as though he wore it more for irony than loyalty. His posture was relaxed, almost careless, as if he was completely at ease in his own skin. He sipped his coffee slowly, his other hand scrolling casually on his phone. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. To her, the hat was more than an accessory, it was a statement. A challenge, even. She nudged her handbag closer, her fingers drumming on the table. The man hadn't looked her way once, but she felt a strange irritation bubbling inside her, as though his mere presence was an affront to her sense of order. Her mind began racing. Who wears that in public? She thought. Does he even understand what it represents? Karen wasn't the kind of person to let things slide. Her self-imposed role as the moral compass of the cafe demanded action, or so she believed. The man, however, seemed oblivious to her brewing indignation. He took another slow sip of his coffee, then adjusted his sunglasses. The movement, casual as it was, struck Karen as annoyingly deliberate, almost like he knew she was watching and didn't care. Karen leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing. She glanced around the room to see if anyone else had noticed him, but most of the other patrons were absorbed in their own worlds. A couple at the next table chatted animatedly about weekend plans. A young woman, earbuds in, scrolled through her phone without looking up. Even the barista behind the counter, usually so attentive, seemed uninterested in the man with the red hat. How can everyone ignore this? Karen thought. She crossed her arms, her mind racing with indignation. She felt like she was the only one seeing the situation for what it was. This wasn't just an ordinary customer grabbing a coffee. This was a blatant display, a provocation, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Still, a small part of her hesitated. Something about the man's demeanor was unusual. He didn't seem defensive or confrontational, the way Karen might have expected from someone making such a bold statement. Instead, he was calm, almost amused, as if he were part of some inside joke no one else understood. Karen brushed the thought aside. It doesn't matter, she told herself. People like him need to be put in their place. Her fingers hovered over her phone, a familiar feeling of self-righteousness fueling her resolve. She glanced at the man again, her glare intensifying. He had set his phone down now, his attention briefly shifting to a nearby table where a child laughed loudly. He smiled faintly, as if entertained by the innocent sound. Karen frowned. To her, even that smile felt calculated, like he was trying to charm the room into ignoring the statement he was making. She wasn't buying it. Her indignation flared anew. Not on my watch, she muttered under her breath. As if sensing her rising tension, a barista approached her table with a friendly smile. Another refill, Karen, the young woman asked, holding a steaming pot of coffee. Karen shook her head distractedly, waving the barista away without breaking her gaze on the man. "No, thank you," she said curtly, her tone sharper than she intended. The barista's smile faltered, but she moved on without comment, used to Karen's brusque manner. The man adjusted his hat slightly, leaning back in his chair. Karen's breath hitched. "He's mocking me," she thought, though the man hadn't so much as glanced in her direction. She could feel her pulse quicken, a mix of frustration and determination coursing through her. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Her first thought was to take a picture. People need to see this, she reasoned. They need to know what kind of person thinks this is acceptable. But as she raised the phone, she hesitated. A photo wouldn't be enough. She needed to do more, something immediate, something that would make an impact. Her thumb moved to the phone's keypad. 911? The thought flickered briefly in her mind, and she felt a thrill of adrenaline. Calling the police might seem extreme to some, but Karen was convinced it was the right thing to do. After all, someone had to stand up for what was right. As she began dialing, a voice in her head whispered a faint warning, "Are you sure about this?" Karen ignored it. She had made up her mind. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed in her wildest assumptions, was that the man seated across the cafe wasn't just any ordinary customer. He wasn't someone she could pigeonhole into her narrow view of the world. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, but she was about to find out. And the consequences would be far beyond anything she could have imagined. Karen's thumb hesitated over the screen for a fraction of a second. It wasn't doubt. Karen rarely doubted herself, but a strategic pause. She had learned that timing was everything when making a statement. She wanted the man's casual air to break, for him to realize he was under scrutiny. And yet, the man remained blissfully unaware, or so she thought. Before she pressed the button, Karen decided to observe him a little longer, to gather more evidence. She convinced herself it was the responsible thing to do. After all, how often do people get accused of jumping to conclusions? Karen wasn't about to let that be her. The man shifted slightly in his chair, the leather of his jacket creaking faintly as he leaned forward to pick up his cup. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if he was the kind of person who never acted without thinking first. Karen noted this with a frown. He didn't fidget or appear nervous, which annoyed her further. To her, his calmness was nothing more than arrogance, a deliberate effort to flaunt his confidence in a way that felt almost provocative. "Arrogant," she muttered under her breath. The word slipped out before she realized it, and the couple at the table beside her turned briefly toward her voice. The woman raised an eyebrow but quickly turned back to her conversation, clearly deciding it was better not to engage. Karen barely noticed them. Her focus was solely on the man. Karen's inner narrative was already spinning into overdrive. Who does he think he is? She thought. People like him believe they can do whatever they want, say whatever they want, and no one will call them out. Well, not today. Not while I'm here. She glanced around the cafe again, as if looking for backup. Surely someone else had noticed him by now. Her eyes scanned the faces of the other patrons, searching for a spark of shared outrage, but what she saw only irritated her further. A young woman in a corner booth was absorbed in her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Two middle-aged men in business suits were deep in conversation, occasionally laughing over their cups. A pair of teenagers were taking selfies with their frappuccinos, giggling as they added filters to their photos. No one seemed to care. No one even noticed. It was infuriating. Karen tapped her nails against the table, the rhythmic clicking a small outlet for her frustration. Am I the only one paying attention? She wondered. Do people really not care anymore? Or are they just too afraid to say something? The man took another sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with the kind of ease that made Karen feel as though he were mocking her indirectly. She felt a surge of heat rise to her cheeks. Her imagination was filling in the gaps now, painting him as a smug provocateur, someone who had carefully chosen that hat to spark outrage and then bask in the attention it brought. She couldn't let him win, not like this. "Excuse me," she called out suddenly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cafe. A few heads turned, including that of the barista behind the counter. The young woman who had served her earlier approached cautiously, her polite smile firmly in place. "Yes, Karen. Is there something I can help you with?" the barista asked. Her tone was friendly, but there was a trace of unease behind her words. Karen had a reputation for being difficult, and the staff had learned to tread carefully around her. Karen gestured toward the man with a sharp tilt of her head. "That man over there," she said, lowering her voice slightly but not enough to keep her words private. "Don't you think it's inappropriate for him to wear something like that in a public place? It's offensive, and frankly, it's making people uncomfortable." The barista blinked, clearly taken aback. She glanced in the direction Karen had indicated and saw the man sitting quietly at his table, still engrossed in his phone. He didn't appear to have noticed Karen's complaint, or if he had, he was doing an excellent job of pretending not to care. The barista began, struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry, Karen, but he's just sitting there. He hasn't done anything wrong. We don't have a dress code, so..." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "So you're just going to let him sit there, flaunting that symbol of hatred," she hissed. "This is supposed to be a welcoming space, isn't it? A safe space." The barista shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the man again. "I understand how you feel," she said carefully, "but he's not breaking any rules. Unless he's causing a disturbance, there's not much we can do." Karen's frustration mounted. She leaned closer to the barista, lowering her voice but increasing its intensity. "Do you think people like that deserve a free pass? If we don't stand up to them, who will?" The barista took a small step back, her polite smile beginning to falter. "I'm really sorry, Karen, but I don't think it's my place to tell him what to wear." Karen huffed, crossing her arms as she leaned back in her chair. "Fine. If you won't do something about it, I will." The barista hesitated for a moment, as though she wanted to say more, but then decided against it. She returned to the counter, glancing over her shoulder once before resuming her duties. Karen watched her go, shaking her head in disbelief. "Coward," she thought. "No one has any backbone anymore." Her hand returned to her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pressed it. The ringing tone filled her ear, and Karen felt a surge of determination as she waited for someone to answer. 911, what's your emergency?" came the calm voice on the other end of the line. Karen straightened in her chair, her voice firm and resolute. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at the downtown cafe on Main Street. There's a man here behaving inappropriately." The operator's tone remained neutral. "Can you describe the situation, ma'am? What exactly is the disturbance?" Karen's eyes darted toward the man as she spoke. "He's wearing a highly offensive hat," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's making people uncomfortable. He's being deliberately provocative." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, wearing a hat isn't typically considered a disturbance. Has the individual threatened anyone or caused any harm?" Karen's frustration boiled over. "It's not just the hat, it's what it represents. He's flaunting it in public, trying to upset people. Isn't that enough?" Another pause. "Ma'am, unless the individual is actively causing harm or breaking the law, there's not much we can do. Wearing a hat, regardless of its message, is not a criminal offense." Karen's grip on the phone tightened. "So you're just going to do nothing?" she snapped. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the operator replied, her tone calm but firm. Unless there's an immediate threat, this isn't a matter for emergency services. Karen ended the call abruptly, her face flushed with anger. She glanced back at the man, who was now looking up from his phone. Their eyes met for the first time, and Karen felt a jolt of surprise. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, not aggressive or confrontational, but calm and steady, as though he knew exactly what had just happened. And then, to her utter shock, he smiled. Karen's scowl deepened as the man adjusted his hat again, the bold red lettering catching the sunlight streaming through the cafe's wide windows. To her, the hat was more than just a piece of fabric. It was an affront, a glaring symbol of division and controversy. Karen's grip tightened around her ceramic coffee mug as she leaned closer to her friend, a woman named Cheryl who sat quietly across from her. Cheryl was accustomed to Karen's tirades but had learned not to encourage them. "People like him," Karen muttered, her voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "are the reason this country's falling apart." Cheryl glanced nervously toward the man but didn't reply. Instead, she sipped her tea and gave Karen a wary smile, the kind that said, "Please don't make a scene." But Karen was already too far gone. Her gaze was locked on the man, who remained seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing across the room. He casually scrolled through his phone, the faint sound of a notification ping audible in the quiet lull between conversations. He set his coffee cup back on the table with a soft clink, a simple gesture that Karen interpreted as a challenge. Her indignation bubbled over. She straightened in her chair and pulled her phone from her bag, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "I'm calling the police," Karen announced loudly, her voice cutting through the cafe's hum of chatter. Her words carried the kind of authority she often wielded when making complaints about late deliveries or inadequate service. "This is a public disturbance." Several heads turned, startled by the declaration. Conversations paused as people glanced between Karen and the man in question. A couple sitting nearby exchanged nervous chuckles, unsure if they should intervene or simply watch the drama unfold. Across the room, the barista behind the counter froze mid-pour, her eyes wide as she watched Karen's theatrics. The man, however, didn't flinch. He finally glanced up from his phone, meeting Karen's glare with a calm, unbothered expression. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Karen's pulse quickened. Then, to her surprise and frustration, the man smiled, a small, almost knowing smile, like he was in on a joke she didn't understand. Karen's hand trembled slightly as she held up her phone. "Yes, 911, she said, her voice sharp and deliberate. "I need to report a disturbance at the downtown cafe on Main Street." The operator's voice on the other end was calm, professional. "What is the nature of the disturbance, ma'am?" Karen's gaze didn't waver from the man. "There's a man here wearing an offensive hat," she said, her tone heavy with indignation. "It's making people uncomfortable. He's being provocative." The operator hesitated, likely weighing the validity of Karen's claim. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "is the individual threatening anyone or causing harm?" Karen bristled. "His hat is a threat," she insisted. "It represents everything that's wrong with society today. And he's flaunting it, right here in public. People are upset." Around her, the cafe patrons continued to watch. Some whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief. Others pretended not to notice, their gazes fixed firmly on their laptops or coffee cups. The operator's tone remained even. "I understand, ma'am, but wearing a hat regardless of its message is not a criminal offense. Unless the individual is actively causing harm, there's no legal basis for police intervention." Karen's face flushed with frustration. "So you're saying you're not going to do anything?" she snapped. "I'm saying this doesn't qualify as an emergency, ma'am," the operator replied firmly. "I suggest you address your concerns directly with the individual or the cafe management." Karen ended the call with a sharp tap of her finger, her cheeks burning. She glanced around the room, hoping to find allies among the other patrons, but most avoided her gaze. A few looked away quickly, hiding smirks behind their hands. Karen's jaw tightened. Unbelievable, she muttered, slipping her phone back into her bag. She turned to Cheryl, who was now staring intently at her half-empty teacup. Can you believe this? Karen demanded. They don't even care. What's the point of having laws if no one enforces them? Cheryl hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Maybe it's not worth the trouble, she said softly. He's not hurting anyone, Karen. Karen's eyes widened, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. Not hurting anyone? Do you have any idea what that hat represents? It's a symbol of hate, Cheryl. Hate. Cheryl shifted in her seat, glancing at the man again. He had returned to his phone, seemingly unfazed by Karen's outburst. I just think, maybe we should let it go, Cheryl said cautiously. Karen shook her head, her indignation reigniting. That's exactly the problem, she said. People like you just let it go. You let them get away with it, and then they think they've won. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She grabbed her bag and marched toward the counter, her heels clicking with purpose. The barista looked up nervously as Karen approached, bracing herself for whatever was about to come. I need to speak to your manager, Karen said, her voice tight with barely restrained fury. The barista blinked. The manager isn't here right now, she said cautiously. Karen crossed her arms. Then you'll do, she said. I want you to tell that man to leave. His presence is upsetting your customers. The barista glanced toward the man, who was now sipping his coffee leisurely, seemingly unaware of the commotion. I'm sorry, ma'am, the barista said, her tone apologetic but firm. We can't ask someone to leave just because of what they're wearing. He hasn't done anything wrong. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her frustration mounting. So you're just going to let him sit there, spreading his hate in your cafe? The barista took a small step back, her hands gripping the counter. I'm really sorry, ma'am, she said, but unless he's causing a disturbance, there's nothing I can do. Karen stared at the barista, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue further, but then she spun on her heel and stormed back to her table. Cheryl watched her return, her expression unreadable. Karen sat down heavily, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. This is what's wrong with the world, she declared loudly. No one has the courage to stand up for what's right anymore. Across the room, the man glanced up again, his calm gaze settling briefly on Karen. He smiled once more, a slow, deliberate smile that made Karen's blood boil. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was in control of the situation, that he was playing a game she didn't understand. And that, more than anything, made her determined to win. But Karen had no idea who she was dealing with or how far her actions would spiral out of her control. Karen's fury burned brighter as the man calmly sipped his coffee, seemingly immune to the firestorm raging in her head. Her hands clenched tightly around the edges of the table, her knuckles whitening. Cheryl, sensing that her friend was on the brink of another outburst, reached out tentatively. Karen, she said in a low voice, maybe we should just finish our drinks and leave. This really isn't worth getting upset over. Karen turned to her, incredulous. Not worth it? Cheryl, do you hear yourself? People like him thrive because people like us stay quiet. This isn't about coffee or a stupid hat. This is about standing up for what's right. Cheryl sighed, rubbing her temples. She had been Karen's friend long enough to know that once she dug her heels in, there was no reasoning with her. But this time, Cheryl had a sinking feeling that Karen's insistence on doing the right thing might backfire spectacularly. The cafe patrons, sensing the palpable tension, returned to their hushed conversations, though more than a few sneaked glances toward Karen and the man. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Karen's eyes darted toward the counter again. The barista was deliberately busying herself, avoiding Karen's gaze. That irritated Karen further. She was used to being taken seriously, to having her complaints addressed swiftly. Being dismissed not just by the staff but by the police operator earlier was a blow to her sense of authority. She tapped her fingers against the table, the rapid rhythm matching her escalating frustration. "Fine," she said aloud, though it wasn't clear who she was talking to. "If no one else will do something, I will." "What are you going to do?" Cheryl asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and dread. Karen didn't answer. Instead, she stood, grabbed her phone, and marched straight toward the man's table. The room went silent. Even the faint hiss of the espresso machine seemed to fade as all eyes turned to Karen. The man, noticing her approach, set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. His expression was calm, almost amused, as he watched her come closer. Karen stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. For a moment, she simply glared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. The man raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth and unhurried. Karen's voice was sharp as she spoke. "Do you realize how offensive that hat is?" The man glanced upward, as if remembering what he was wearing. Then he looked back at her, his expression unchanging. "I'm aware of what it says," he replied. "Is there a problem?" "A problem?" Karen's voice rose slightly, her indignation bubbling over. "Yes, there's a problem. That hat represents hate and division. It's not something you should be flaunting in a public place, especially where people are just trying to enjoy their day." The man tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "I see," he said slowly. "But last I checked, this was a free country. Am I breaking any laws by wearing it?" Karen bristled. "It's not about laws," she snapped. "It's about decency. Respect. If you had any, you wouldn't be sitting here, trying to provoke people." The man's calm demeanor didn't waver. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the interaction, which only fueled Karen's frustration. "Let me ask you something," he said, folding his hands on the table. "Do you know me? Have I said anything offensive to you or anyone else here?" Karen hesitated. "You don't have to say anything. That hat says enough." The man nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her point. "So, you've judged everything about me based on this hat?" "It's not judgment," Karen retorted. "It's common sense. People who wear that hat stand for everything wrong with society." The man's lips twitched, as though he were suppressing a smile. "Interesting," he said. "Because I could say the same about people who assume the worst about others without bothering to ask questions." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, she felt a flicker of uncertainty, but she quickly pushed it aside. "I'm not here to debate with you," she said firmly. "I'm here to stand up for what's right. And what's right is asking you to take that hat off or leave." The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "And what gives you the right to make that demand?" he asked. Karen faltered, unprepared for the question. She glanced around the room, hoping for some backup. A few patrons avoided her gaze, while others watched with thinly veiled amusement. Cheryl, sitting stiffly at their table, looked as though she wanted to disappear. "I'm not the only one upset by this," Karen said finally, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The man chuckled softly, the sound low and unhurried. "Are you sure about that?" Karen's frustration reached its peak. She turned toward the rest of the cafe, her arms spread wide. "Does anyone here think this is okay?" she demanded. "Are we just going to sit back and let people like him spread hate wherever they want?" The silence that followed was deafening. A few patrons exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. Karen's face flushed as the lack of support stung her pride. "Looks like it's just you," the man said quietly. Karen whipped back around to face him, her glare sharper than ever. "People like you think you can get away with anything," she hissed. "But you'll see. One day, people won't stay quiet anymore." The man leaned back in his chair again, a faint smile on his face. "Well," he said, "today isn't that day, is it?" Karen stared at him, her mind racing for a retort. But before she could speak, the man reached for his coffee cup and took a long, deliberate sip. Then he picked up his phone and returned his attention to the screen, as if she weren't even there. The dismissal stung more than anything he could have said. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her fists clenched at her sides. Finally, she turned and marched back to her table, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. Cheryl didn't say anything as Karen sat down heavily in her chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Karen muttered under her breath, "This isn't over." But as the man continued to sit, unbothered, Karen began to realize that she might have underestimated him. There was something about his calmness, his refusal to be rattled, that unsettled her. And for the first time, a small, unwelcome thought crept into her mind: what if I'm the one in the wrong? She quickly pushed the thought away. She wasn't wrong, she couldn't be. She just needed to figure out her next move. The tension in the cafe lingered, heavy and oppressive, as the quiet buzz of conversations resumed. But Karen's mind was far from quiet. And as she sat there, her anger simmering, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen's voice rose as she launched into another tirade, her words spilling out faster than her thoughts could organize them. "There are rules about public decency, about not inciting others. That hat is offensive, and he knows it. He's practically asking for trouble." The barista, whose face was now flushed with discomfort, kept her tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but he's not breaking any rules. We can't ask someone to leave just because of what they're wearing." Karen scoffed, throwing her hands up. "So, you're just going to stand there and do nothing while he spreads his hateful message? This is why society's crumbling, because people like you don't take a stand." The barista, clearly at a loss, glanced toward the manager's office, hoping for some backup. But the door remained closed, and Karen's frustration only grew in the silence. Across the room, the man remained unfazed. He had shifted slightly in his seat, his posture relaxed as he tapped away on his phone. Occasionally, his gaze flicked up, scanning the room with a calm detachment that only added to the intrigue building among the patrons. "Who is that guy?" a young woman at a nearby table whispered to her companion. "He looks familiar. Like I've seen him before." Her friend squinted, trying to place the man's face. "You're right. There's something about him. Maybe he's famous." The whispers began to spread. Some patrons exchanged curious glances, while others discreetly Googled descriptions of the man, hoping to uncover his identity. His cool demeanor and the way he seemed entirely unbothered by Karen's spectacle only deepened the mystery. Karen, however, was oblivious to the growing murmurs. She was too focused on her duty to care about anything else. Her phone was pressed to her ear as she leaned into her second call to the police, her voice dripping with indignation. "Yes, I already called, but this situation is getting worse," she said, glaring at the man as if he could hear her through the line. "Now he's sitting there, ignoring everyone, acting like he owns the place. It's escalating." The operator on the other end remained calm, though her patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am," she said, her tone measured, "we've reviewed your earlier report, and there's no actionable offense here. If the individual isn't causing harm or breaking any laws, there's nothing we can do." Karen's face reddened. "So, You're saying anyone can walk around wearing offensive symbols and there's nothing the police will do about it? This is unacceptable. Ma'am, I suggest you speak with the cafe staff if you have concerns, the operator replied. Have a good day. The line went dead, and Karen stared at her phone in disbelief. Unbelievable, she muttered, shoving it back into her bag. Cheryl, who had been quietly observing, took a deep breath and spoke cautiously. Karen, maybe this isn't worth it. The police aren't coming, and the barista isn't going to do anything. Why don't we just let it go? Let it go. Karen snapped, her eyes blazing. That's exactly what people like him count on, everyone just letting it go. Well, I won't. She turned her glare back to the man, who had now put his phone down and was sipping his coffee, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Karen thought she saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes, and it only fueled her anger. Meanwhile, the whispers among the patrons grew louder. One man, seated by the door, leaned toward his table mate. I'm telling you, that guy looks like someone important. Maybe a politician or a tech guy. He's got that look, you know. The table mate frowned. Yeah, but if he were famous, wouldn't we recognize him right away? Maybe he's one of those low-key billionaires or something. As the theories swirled, one bold patron decided to take matters into their own hands. A young man with a laptop approached the counter, leaning in to speak to the barista. Hey, do you know who that guy is? He asked, nodding toward the man in the MAGA hat. The barista shook her head. No idea. He's been here a few times before, but he keeps to himself. Why? The young man shrugged, his curiosity piqued. He just seems. I don't know, like he doesn't belong here. Not in a bad way, but like he's used to bigger things. The barista glanced at the man again, her brow furrowing. She hadn't paid much attention before, but now that it was mentioned, there was something oddly compelling about him. His calmness, his air of confidence, it all felt deliberate, as if he was playing a part in a drama only he understood. Karen, still fuming, didn't notice the subtle shift in the room. All she saw was a man sitting smugly, untouched by her efforts to hold him accountable. She leaned forward, her voice low and sharp as she spoke to Cheryl. I bet he's doing this on purpose, she said. Sitting here with that stupid hat, knowing exactly how people will react. It's probably some kind of stunt. Cheryl hesitated, glancing at the man again. If it is, you're kind of playing into it, she said carefully. Karen glared at her. Whose side are you on, Cheryl? I'm just saying, Cheryl replied, her tone placating. Maybe he's trying to get a rise out of people, and the best thing we can do is ignore him. But Karen wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. His calmness, his refusal to engage, it all felt too calculated, too deliberate. And then, as if on cue, the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black card. He placed it on the table, tapping it lightly with one finger as he returned to his phone. The gesture was subtle, but it caught the attention of a few nearby patrons. What's that? Someone whispered. Looks like a business card or something, another replied. Karen's eyes narrowed. She couldn't see the card clearly from where she sat, but the way the man handled it so casually, yet deliberately, made her suspicious. What's he up to now? She muttered, leaning forward in her seat. The man, still oblivious to or perhaps fully aware of the attention he was garnering, picked up the card and slipped it back into his pocket. Then, he glanced around the room, his gaze briefly meeting Karen's before moving on. That brief moment of eye contact sent a shiver down Karen's spine. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something else, something she couldn't quite name. Across the room, the young man with the laptop opened a new tab and began typing furiously, piecing together clues to identify the mysterious patron. Meanwhile, The tension in the cafe continued to simmer, the air thick with unspoken questions. Who was he? And more importantly, what was he waiting for? Karen's irritation reached a fever pitch as she leaned across the table, her glare fixed firmly on the man. Every move he made seemed to taunt her: a deliberate sip of coffee, a relaxed shift in his seat, the brief smirk that played at the corners of his mouth. She couldn't take it anymore. "What's your problem?" she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Cheryl to hear but quiet enough to avoid the attention of the entire cafe. Cheryl raised her eyebrows, silently urging Karen to let it go. But Karen wasn't the type to let anything slide. She grabbed her phone again, tapping furiously as she scrolled through her contacts. If the police wouldn't intervene, maybe a call to a journalist she knew would stir up some much-needed attention. "I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person this guy is," she muttered, her fingers flying over the screen. Cheryl sighed, sinking deeper into her chair, wishing she were anywhere else. Meanwhile, the cafe buzzed with low whispers. The young man with the laptop was deep into his impromptu investigation, cross-referencing images and news articles in an effort to identify the mysterious man in the red hat. "I swear I've seen his face before," he murmured to himself. A few tables away, another patron had also joined the hunt, surreptitiously snapping a photo of the man and running it through a reverse image search. Karen, still typing furiously, glanced up and noticed the subtle shift in the room. People weren't just watching her anymore, they were watching him. She frowned, her annoyance giving way to curiosity. What was it about this man that had everyone so intrigued? The man, seemingly oblivious, finished his coffee and leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocked behind his head. It was a relaxed pose, almost too relaxed, as though he was intentionally putting on a show. And then, he did something that sent a ripple of speculation through the cafe. He stood. The simple act of rising from his chair was enough to draw the eyes of every single patron. Karen watched intently as he reached into his pocket again, pulling out the same black card he had tapped on the table earlier. This time, he held it up for a moment, his gaze scanning the room as though daring anyone to ask him what it was. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he slipped it back into his pocket and began walking toward the door. Karen's breath caught. Was he leaving? No, he couldn't leave. Not after everything she had gone through to make a point. "Where do you think you're going?" she called out, her voice sharp and demanding. The man paused, turning slowly to face her. His expression was calm, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Is there something you need?" he asked, his tone polite but edged with challenge. Karen rose from her seat, her heart pounding. "I'm not done with you," she said, her voice trembling slightly but still firm. The man raised an eyebrow. "Done with me," he repeated. "I wasn't aware we'd started anything." The cafe fell silent again, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. Cheryl tugged at Karen's sleeve, whispering urgently, "Sit down, Karen. Please." But Karen ignored her. She took a step forward, her hands on her hips. "You walk in here wearing that hat, acting like you're better than everyone else. Like you're untouchable. But I'm not afraid to call you out." The man tilted his head, studying her for a moment. Then, to Karen's surprise, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down her spine. "I admire your passion," he said. "Really, I do. But you should be careful about making assumptions." Karen's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the black card once more. This time, he extended it toward her, holding it between two fingers. "Here," he said. "Take a look." Karen hesitated, her instincts warning her not to fall into whatever trap he was setting. But curiosity got the better of her. She reached out and took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. The card was sleek and unassuming, with a matte black finish and embossed silver lettering. Karen squinted at the text, her lips moving silently as she read the words. Her face went pale. "Wait," Cheryl said, leaning over to peek at the card. "What does it say?" Karen didn't answer. She just stared at the card, her mind racing. It couldn't be true, it had to be some kind of joke. But the man's calm expression told her otherwise. "Now do you understand?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Karen looked up at him, her mouth dry. Why didn't you say anything before?" The man chuckled softly. "Because you didn't ask." The cafe erupted into whispers as the patrons tried to piece together what had just happened. Cheryl grabbed the card from Karen's hand, her eyes widening as she read the text. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Karen, do you know who this is?" Karen's mind was spinning. She felt like the ground had shifted beneath her, leaving her struggling to find her balance. Everything she thought she knew about this man, about the situation, none of it made sense anymore. The man reached out and plucked the card from Cheryl's hands, tucking it back into his pocket. "It's been a pleasure," he said, nodding politely to the room. "But I've got somewhere to be." He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving behind a stunned silence. Karen sank back into her chair, her face a mixture of shock and humiliation. Cheryl sat beside her, still processing what she had read. "Karen," she said quietly, "you really messed up this time." But Karen couldn't respond. She was too busy replaying the last few minutes in her head, trying to make sense of the revelation that had turned her world upside down. And as the whispers in the cafe grew louder, one question hung heavily in the air. Who was that man? Karen's jaw dropped as Elon Musk adjusted his hat, looking directly at her. The room was dead silent, the only sound the faint hum of the espresso machine in the background. The weight of what she had done began to settle in her chest, pressing down like a heavy stone. Elon glanced at the officers, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'd like to think this is just a misunderstanding," he said, his tone even but pointed. "Though I'm curious what I've done to warrant this level of attention." The lead officer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Mr. Musk, it appears this woman believed you were causing a disturbance." He turned to Karen, his expression stern. "Ma'am, can you explain what exactly prompted you to call us?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her mind raced for an explanation that didn't make her look like a fool, but every word she could think of sounded worse than silence. Cheryl leaned away from her, as if trying to avoid being associated with the fiasco. Finally, Karen managed to stammer, I thought he was trying to provoke people, with the hat." Elon's eyes sparkled with amusement as he glanced at the bright red MAGA hat perched on his head. "Ah," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "So, this is about the hat." Karen nodded weakly, her cheeks flushed. "It's just, people get upset when they see things like that. It's divisive." Elon shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just a hat. Sometimes a symbol is what people make of it." The young man with the laptop couldn't hold back anymore. He burst out laughing, breaking the tension in the room. "Karen, you called the cops on Elon Musk, because of a hat? Do you even know who you're talking to?" Karen glared at him, her embarrassment quickly morphing into indignation. "I don't care who he is. No one's above the rules." Elon raised an eyebrow. "Rules? Which ones would those be?" Karen faltered again, realizing she was dangerously close to digging an even deeper hole for herself. The rule about not disturbing people." Elon tilted his head, genuinely intrigued. "And wearing a hat quietly while drinking coffee disturbs people how exactly?" The officer held up a hand, stepping between them. "Mr. Musk, we're sorry for any inconvenience this caused. Clearly, there's been a misunderstanding." He turned back to Karen, his expression now firmly authoritative. Ma'am, you should know that filing a false report is a serious offense. You claimed there was a public disturbance, but we see no evidence of that here. Karen's face turned scarlet. She opened her mouth to protest but thought better of it. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she mumbled. Elon chuckled softly. Things have a way of escalating when people act on assumptions. Cheryl leaned in and whispered urgently, Karen, you need to apologize. Now. Karen shot her a sharp look but knew Cheryl was right. Turning to Elon, she forced a tight smile. I'm sorry if I overreacted. I didn't realize who you were. Elon nodded, accepting the apology with grace. Fair enough. But maybe next time, don't jump to conclusions. The world could use a little more understanding and a lot less judgment. The tension in the cafe began to dissipate as the officers signaled that the situation was resolved. The lead officer turned back to Elon, extending a hand. Sorry again for the trouble, Mr. Musk. If there's anything else you need, let us know. Elon shook the officer's hand. Appreciate it. But I think I'll be fine. As the officers exited the cafe, a wave of murmurs swept through the room. The patrons, who had been silent spectators, now whispered animatedly among themselves. Karen sank into her chair, feeling the weight of every stare in the room. She avoided eye contact, her earlier bravado completely gone. Cheryl patted her hand awkwardly. Well, that was something. Elon, now standing near the door, turned back to the room. Thanks for the coffee, he said, addressing the barista with a warm smile. And the entertainment. With that, he placed a generous tip into the jar and walked out, leaving behind a cafe full of stunned onlookers and one very humiliated Karen. As the door swung shut, the young man with the laptop chuckled, shaking his head. That's one for the history books, he said. Karen versus Elon Musk. Spoiler, Elon won. The entire cafe erupted in laughter, and for the first time that day, Karen was completely, utterly silent. As the sound of laughter filled the cafe, Karen remained seated, feeling smaller and smaller by the second. She could still hear the echoes of her earlier words, how she'd proclaimed with such confidence that the man was disturbing the peace. Her face was still bright red, and the pit in her stomach seemed to grow deeper with every passing moment. She barely noticed Cheryl as she slipped out of her chair, her fingers brushing the table as she stood. Come on, Karen, Cheryl said softly, we need to go. But Karen didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of everything was too much. The world had just flipped on its head in a way she never imagined. Outside, the sound of the street continued, people moving about their busy day, unaware of the spectacle that had just unfolded. Inside the cafe, the air had shifted. What had been an ordinary morning of coffee and conversation was now the backdrop of an extraordinary blunder. Cheryl stood by the door for a moment, glancing back at Karen with a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. I think you should go apologize. At least to the staff. Karen looked up at Cheryl, blinking in disbelief. You think I'm going to apologize? After everything? Cheryl sighed, sitting back down across from her. Karen, you've made a huge mistake. And you don't want this to follow you around for the rest of your life. Do you? Karen opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't form the words. Cheryl was right. She had let herself be carried away by a hasty judgment, one that not only made her look foolish but also caused a scene in front of dozens of strangers. Worse still, she'd almost called the police on one of the richest and most influential men in the world, a man who had made waves in countless industries. The weight of that realization crushed her. I thought I was standing up for what was right, Karen said quietly, her voice tinged with regret. But now, it's all just embarrassing. I made a fool of myself. Cheryl softened her tone. I know, but you've got to own up to it. You can't just ignore it. The whole place saw what happened. And who knows how long this story will circulate now. Karen's hands clenched around her cup, the cold ceramic a welcome distraction. I didn't even know it was him. If I had, I never would've, but I let my anger cloud everything. I assumed, and look what happened. Cheryl exhaled. It's going to be okay, Karen. Just talk to the barista and try to clear things up. And maybe next time, think before you react. Karen nodded, feeling her resolve return, even if it was just a tiny flicker. Slowly, she stood up from her seat and walked to the counter, where the young barista who had tried to defuse the situation earlier was still cleaning cups. "Hi," Karen said hesitantly, her voice softer now. "I just wanted to apologize for everything. I didn't mean to cause a scene or make you uncomfortable." The barista looked up, meeting Karen's gaze with a cool but understanding expression. "It's all right," she said. "You were upset, and people sometimes react without thinking." Karen nodded, swallowing her pride. "I made a mistake. I should have asked questions before jumping to conclusions. I'm sorry for bringing the police into it." The barista smiled slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "It happens. Just, next time, maybe consider taking a step back before doing something drastic. Everyone's got their own story." Karen nodded again, feeling the weight of the lesson settle deep within her. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. With a final look at the barista, Karen turned back to Cheryl, who was waiting by the door with an impatient yet supportive look. Karen's mind was still racing as they left the cafe. She couldn't stop thinking about how her snap judgment had led to this chain of events. The walk to the car felt like a blur. Karen's thoughts were all over the place, replaying the events in vivid detail. She was embarrassed, humiliated, and still in shock at how everything had unfolded. As they reached the car, Cheryl finally spoke up. "Karen, you've got to stop letting your assumptions dictate your actions. This is something that could follow you for a long time." Karen shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "I know. I've learned the hard way, haven't I?" Cheryl looked at her, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "Yeah, but the important thing is you learned. We all make mistakes. It's how we own up to them that counts." Karen opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, her hands still shaking. She took a deep breath and turned the key in the ignition, the engine coming to life with a soft hum. "I'm going to make it right," she said, more to herself than to Cheryl. "I'll apologize to him. Maybe I can fix this." Cheryl buckled her seatbelt and smiled. "That's the spirit." As Karen drove off, she couldn't help but think about Elon Musk and how easily she had underestimated him. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that she was in the right. Yet, in a matter of minutes, everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down. Was it his wealth and fame that had made her so quick to judge him? Or was it the power of a symbol, a hat that she assumed stood for something it didn't? Karen wasn't sure. But what she did know was that she had learned an important lesson that day, one she wouldn't forget anytime soon. The story of the cafe incident would likely be one that followed her for a long time, spreading like wildfire across social media, but Karen had learned that it was how you reacted in the face of embarrassment that truly mattered. Karen's walk to the outside of the cafe felt like a slow march to defeat. The officers flanked her, their presence a quiet reminder of the gravity of the situation. She could feel the stares of the remaining customers as they watched her exit, a silent wave of judgment trailing behind her. Her hands were cold, her mind racing, and she couldn't shake the red-hot embarrassment that flooded her chest. Outside, the cool morning air didn't offer much relief from the heat building inside her. The police officers didn't say much as they guided her down the steps, only exchanging a few words between themselves. Karen's mind was spinning with thoughts, trying to grasp what had just happened. How had she gone from being the one in control, calling the shots, to the one being escorted out in humiliation? The officers were polite but firm. "Ma'am, we just need to have a quick discussion about your actions inside the cafe. We take false reports very seriously. You understand that, right?" Karen nodded silently, unable to speak. The words felt stuck in her throat, a lump of regret sitting heavy. She had no defense, no excuse to offer. She had made a snap judgment based on assumptions, and now she had to face the consequences. But it wasn't just the officers that she feared. The crowd in the cafe had seen everything. They had witnessed her self-righteousness, and now, the world outside would, too. The officers led her around the corner, away from the cafe's front door. "We'll be filing a report about your actions," one of them said, his voice not unkind but firm. "You'll have to answer for what happened today." Karen opened her mouth to protest but immediately shut it again. What could she say? What could she possibly say that would undo what she had done? She could already feel the weight of the apology she would owe not only to the officers but to everyone who had witnessed her outburst. Meanwhile, inside the cafe, the mood had shifted completely. The excitement in the room was palpable. It was as though an unexpected guest had just walked in, and now the patrons were eager to discuss everything they had just witnessed. Some took out their phones, eager to capture the moment. "Elon Musk, can you believe it?" a voice said from behind one of the tables. A couple of young men approached Elon, who had casually settled back into his seat, not a hint of tension on his face. The bright red MAGA hat remained tilted slightly to one side, and his sunglasses sat in his lap. His posture was relaxed, almost as if the chaos of the past few minutes had been nothing more than an amusing distraction. "Mr. Musk, would you mind if we took a quick picture?" one of the young men asked, a touch of disbelief still in his voice. Elon glanced up at them, offering his trademark smirk. "Sure," he said easily. "Why not?" A flurry of activity followed, with several people coming over for selfies. Elon didn't seem to mind at all, obliging each request with a grin or a quick wave. For him, it was just another day, albeit one that had gained some unintended attention. To the onlookers, however, this was a moment they would tell their friends about for years. "Do you think she knew who he was?" another voice asked, clearly referring to Karen. The cafe erupted into hushed laughter, the awkwardness of the situation now turning into a source of entertainment. "Yeah, she probably thought she was doing the right thing, but that was definitely a moment she won't forget," someone else chimed in. Outside, Karen's world had shrunk down to just the two officers walking beside her. Their silence hung heavy in the air as they walked a few blocks away from the cafe, making sure they were out of earshot of any lingering bystanders. When they finally stopped, the officer who had been quiet the longest spoke. "Ma'am, I understand that you might have been upset, but making a false report to the police is something we can't ignore. People rely on us to be serious, and you put us in a position where we had to waste resources for something that wasn't a crime." Karen swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words. The reality of the situation was setting in. She had acted on her emotions, thinking she was making a difference, when in fact, she had only created more problems. The officer wasn't being harsh, but there was a clear seriousness to his tone that made Karen realize just how big of a mistake she had made. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I was just so angry. And I thought I was helping." The officer nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We get that. People are passionate about things, and it's easy to react without thinking. But you need to understand that what you did goes beyond a simple misunderstanding. When you involve the police, you put the entire community at risk." "I know," Karen muttered. "I never thought it would get this far. I was so sure that I was right, but now I see that I wasn't." "Good," the officer said, his tone more understanding now. That's all we ask. Don't repeat the same mistake next time. You can't always act on your assumptions. People are more than what you think they are. I'll make it right, Karen said, more to herself than to him. She had to. She didn't know how yet, but she couldn't just let this go. Meanwhile, back inside the cafe, the laughter had started to die down, but the buzz remained. People continued to chat about the strange turn of events. Elon had become the talk of the town. Every conversation was laced with curiosity. Who was this man? Why was he there? And what was with the MAGA hat? Elon, for his part, seemed unconcerned by the attention. He sipped his coffee, tapping away on his phone, occasionally glancing up at the crowd. Despite the earlier chaos, he seemed perfectly at ease, a man accustomed to being the center of attention, for both the right and wrong reasons. His unbothered demeanor only added to the mystique surrounding the entire ordeal. Eventually, the cafe began to calm down. The officers returned to their patrol cars, and the patrons slowly filtered out, the events of the morning already fading into the background. For some, it would be a fleeting memory, a funny story to share with friends. For others, it was something they would never forget. But for Karen, the lesson she learned that day would stay with her forever. The internet had already begun its work, turning the incident into a viral sensation. Her face, caught in a moment of public indignation, was already circulating on social media. Karen calls the police on Elon Musk became the headline that would follow her around, and as much as she tried to brush it off, she knew it was a moment that couldn't be erased. As Karen and the officers parted ways, the weight of her actions still pressing on her, she couldn't help but think about the people she had judged, the assumptions she had made. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to learn to look beyond the surface. Time to stop seeing the world in black and white and start understanding that things were more complicated than she realized. With the incident now behind her, Karen knew she had to face the consequences head-on. The viral video, the social media posts, and the embarrassment would follow her, but it was up to her to take responsibility. She could either let this moment define her, or she could use it to grow and change. As she walked away from the scene, Karen realized that justice had already been served. Not in the form of any legal punishment, but in the way the world had reacted, in the lesson she had learned, and in the realization that actions have consequences. For Elon, this was just another bizarre chapter in the story of his life. For Karen, it was the beginning of a much-needed shift in perspective. And as for the cafe patrons, they had witnessed an unforgettable moment, a reminder that the world is not always as simple as it seems. And, for Karen, the road ahead would be about doing better, not just for others, but for herself. As Elon stepped out of the cafe, the door chimed softly behind him. The bustle of the cafe seemed to slow for a moment, and the atmosphere hung in the air, thick with a mix of awe and confusion. He paused just outside, turning back toward the barista who had served him earlier. Sometimes, people jump to conclusions before knowing the full story, Elon said with a wry smile, loud enough for everyone still inside to hear. Always pays to stay curious. The words rang out like a quiet truth, settling in the hearts and minds of the patrons who had witnessed the chaos unfold. They weren't just words of wisdom, but a reminder of something deeper, that life isn't always as simple as we make it. We often see only a fraction of the picture, but we rush to judge based on that little piece. And in doing so, we miss the bigger, richer story. As soon as Elon's sentence hung in the air, the room erupted in cheers. People laughed, clapped, and murmured among themselves, clearly moved by the moment. The scene had shifted once again, from the tension and discomfort caused by Karen's actions to something much more uplifting. The energy in the cafe was lighter now, as if the collective weight of the situation had been lifted. Elon's words had a way of defusing the tension, turning the entire episode into a powerful lesson, one that no one in the room would forget anytime soon. But for Karen, the lesson wasn't over. She might not have been in the cafe anymore, but her name had already begun to spread far beyond that small space. The incident had gone viral in a way that only social media could make possible. Videos of the confrontation, now reshared thousands of times, featured the defining moment, Karen's bold proclamation to the police, followed by her swift realization of the truth. The posts, the memes, the tweets, each one was a ripple in a much larger sea of judgment and humor, and Karen's face had become a symbol of a lesson learned the hard way. As her walk away from the cafe turned into a ride home in silence, she reflected on the weight of it all. Karen wasn't just embarrassed because of what had happened. She was embarrassed because she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the first time she had jumped to conclusions. And perhaps, it wouldn't be the last. But she was also beginning to understand that this moment wasn't just about the public humiliation. It was about change. Karen knew that in the end, the experience had taught her something crucial. It was easy to make assumptions based on a few details, to leap to conclusions without thinking, especially when emotions ran high. And while she had been so certain in her outrage, she now saw how misplaced it had been. She hadn't given the man Elon, it turned out, the chance to be more than what her assumptions had made him out to be. In that moment, Karen realized that judgment should be reserved until we understand the full story. Karen's thoughts turned to her own biases. How many other times in her life had she allowed herself to act based on assumptions? How often had she judged someone's character by their appearance, their choice of clothing, or their words? As the weight of these realizations pressed on her, Karen felt a surge of both regret and hope. Regret for the way she had acted, but hope because, in that very moment, she understood the lesson that life had offered her. She had been granted the opportunity to grow. In that very humbling moment, Karen's heart started to shift. She didn't know exactly how she would make things right, but she knew she had to. She couldn't undo the embarrassment or erase the viral video of her confrontation, but she could learn from it. This wasn't just a lesson in humility, it was a lesson in humanity. Back at the cafe, the buzz of the crowd slowly began to settle into casual conversation. People had gone from astonished to amused, but beneath the laughter was a deeper lesson. The chaos caused by a simple misunderstanding had brought people closer together, if only for a short while. There was a sense of community in the shared experience, a realization that even the most seemingly insignificant moments can change the way we see the world. And in this case, it had changed Karen. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What had started as a typical day for a woman with strong opinions and assumptions had ended up becoming a viral moment that made her realize how often she had been wrong. And while it was clear that the lesson had been delivered in the most public way possible, it was also evident that the lesson was one that everyone could learn from. For the patrons in the cafe, it was a reminder to think before they acted, to ask more questions before making snap judgments. For some, it was a light-hearted moment to laugh about, but for others, it was something much more meaningful. It had shown them how easy it is to let bias and assumption rule their thoughts, and how important it was to challenge those preconceived notions. As for Elon, he had moved on from the encounter with his usual ease. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and as he disappeared into the distance, the only trace left of him was the small piece of wisdom he had shared. His words were a soft but important reminder to everyone in that cafe: stay curious. Don't rush to judgment. People are more than the labels we place on them. And for Karen, that message was a pivotal turning point in her life. It was as if the universe had given her a chance to reset, to reconsider her approach to the world around her. She wasn't sure how exactly to begin, but she knew that something had to change. No longer could she react impulsively, thinking she knew everything without truly understanding the full story. Karen's transformation didn't happen overnight. The road ahead would be one of small steps, one of careful introspection and quiet change. It would take time for her to rebuild the trust she had lost, both with herself and with the people she had wronged. But the most important part of the journey had already begun. She had learned the first lesson, to stay curious, to seek the truth, and to never judge based on surface-level appearances. Elon's departure from the cafe wasn't just the end of a strange morning, it was the beginning of something for Karen. It was a beginning that would, in time, shape who she became. The journey wasn't going to be easy. There would be times when the urge to judge or assume would rise up again. But now, Karen had something stronger to fight it, an understanding that actions have consequences, and that those consequences aren't always as simple as we think. As the story of the day continued to spread, so did the message. For all of us, it's easy to make snap judgments, to assume we know the whole story. But as Karen learned the hard way, the world is far more complex than we give it credit for. Before jumping to conclusions, before assuming someone's intentions or beliefs, it's important to take a moment to stay curious. Only then can we truly understand and appreciate the full story of those around us. And in that, we find the most valuable lesson of all, that true wisdom comes not from certainty, but from understanding.